Hoi! The New World PTR that we have at the moment, the open beta, comes with quite a few new perks and some changed perks, which I wanted to briefly talk about. We're starting with Health, which is a changed perk, but in this case it's a bit weird, because you can see here previously on live it said plus 2.5% max health, and now increases max health by 2.4% of the base value. But Mixologic has looked into this, and turns out that internally nothing seems to actually be changed in terms of the values. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on here. It's the same thing for the Amulet health perk as well, as you can see here. It also says this base value aspect. So I know there's a lot of commotion in the community about that right now, and I'm not really sure what's actually going to happen, because as far as I can tell, nothing may have changed about the perk. It may just be a wording change. Health being nerfed, if that is the case, would be rather odd, just given that it wasn't completely overbearing anymore. In many PvP scenarios it wasn't necessarily favored. It was still present, but not overly present. It wasn't oppressive or anything. So I would be surprised if they choose to nerf it so much that it's basically not a relevant perk anymore. So yeah, hold your horses on health in particular. That one may just be a wording thing. It may be a bit weird. The next one, however, is an actual nerf. You can see here stamina recovery. We have the old value of below 50% health. You gain 107 stamina, now 60 stamina. In addition, the cooldown has also been increased from 30 seconds to 45 seconds. I always thought it was a bit ridiculous that you're effectively getting 3 dodges in light, especially, where I think this was the biggest problem. I think this is one of the most insane escape tools for ranged players if they get in trouble. And I think this nerf in general is appropriate. I thought the value was always completely ridiculous, and I think 60 stamina is still a decent amount. It's still 2 dodges worth of stamina, so can't really complain there. It obviously has an impact for other roles as well, like if you're playing this with a tank and this is your safety net to get some block back up, but I think primarily this is going to reduce mobility to some degree, which I personally am very happy about. To me, stamina recovery was one of the most broken perks since its release. Not the biggest, strongest war perk, but a very effective perk in smaller scale combat, and I believe this nerf was warranted, has been warranted for a very long time, so I'm glad it's finally happening. Contagious Upheaval is not technically new, because it's just Contagious Reverse Step, but Upheaval is a new ability. Deals a little bit more damage, 200 base damage. Other than that, the effects here remain the same, but I wanted to point it out that it has been renamed, at least so you know what it is. And that brings us to the actual new perks. The first one of those is a PvP-only perk, Penetrating the Empowered. Critical hits against empowered players will have 10% armor penetration and reduce the duration of empowers on them by 7%, with a 1 second cooldown on the reduction. This is something that applies on every weapon, so melee as well as ranged, and I believe that this will be a pretty strong perk overall. It is worth keeping in mind that this is only for critical hits. This is something that I initially missed. I thought that this was all hits, which would have made this more valuable, but this could have interesting applications anyways. Though with the critical hits condition, it is a bit more limited in its viability to builds that utilize at least some degree of crit. Armor penetration is generally very strong, but with it being in combination with critical hits, it's kind of like closer to vicious than I thought. And I think the empower reduction is not that relevant, 7%, not that much. But I do think with the armor penetration there is applications for this in crit builds. What's also interesting is this is a proc perk, and meanwhile Penetrating Backstab is a damage type perk, so you can technically get a lot of pen out of this if you combine the two, as one of them comes with 27 pen, and that's on Backstab, so it's a guaranteed crit, so you're also going to get this 10% pen on top of that. 37% pen sounds pretty painful. Question remains here how empowered players are specified. I'm assuming this won't factor in something like Honing Stones, otherwise it will just always proc, but it should be something that consistently procs either way, because most people have some degree of empowers in their builds and their abilities. Empowered Cleave is a bit of a weird one. Hitting 2 players with a single melee attack grants an empower, increasing damage of the next 2 hits within 5 seconds by 20% with a 3 seconds activation cooldown. This reminds me a bit of the Great Axe perk that gives you haste if you hit 2 players. I think the applications here are just very limited because you have to be in a scenario where you are hitting 2 players with a single melee attack. That's not very feasible with certain weapons, like you wouldn't put this on a rapier. It is something that you could see like on a Great Axe, for example, but most Great Axes aren't exactly empower hungry, and you're not going to care about an empower for 2 hits that much either. Maybe Great Sword similarly, but that's also something that already has a decent amount of empower. And most other weapons are really not that great at hitting multiple targets, or if they are, then they don't really care that much for empowers, like Flail, for example. So something you can put on your ring, but I'm not seeing all too much application or too many use cases for this. Thorny Reflection is something you can put on your chest or your gloves. If you take a critical hit only, you will reflect nature damage back at the target equal to 7% of your weapon damage and reduce the attacker's crit chance by 10% for 3 seconds with a 1 second cooldown. Feels too conditional to me, especially scaling with your own weapon damage. Like, you would get this on a tank. Sure, the crit reduction is nice, but it's just a little bit too little in my eyes for it to really be effective enough or scary enough. Maybe I'm wrong here, but I could see like a tank throwing this in because why not? But I'm not thinking that this is going to be a meta build for most players. Hasted Vigor is kind of interesting because it reduces the potency of incoming damage over time effects by 7%. What isn't mentioned here, or like what isn't specified, is the potency, because it's not the same wording here as Vigor, right? So Vigor has the base duration being decreased. I'm assuming potency will actually mean damage reduction. It could have just been worded better if that's the case. It's like reduce the damage of overtime effects by 7%. But yeah, that's what I'm guessing anyways. So it's a damage reduction, which I think is more valuable than a duration reduction, because the first ticks may be your biggest problem, and if they hit less hard, that's going to be nice. And it's per armor piece, so you can have this on multiple pieces. And if you take a hit while inflicted with a dot, you gain 10% haste for 5 seconds. This is, I think the haste is not going to stack, by the way. This is very nice for any melee player that needs to get close to a ranged player while getting poked. If you get hit by a poison shot, for example, or if you get hit by fireball dots or something, like all of that kind of stuff, you're getting this free 10% haste. And if you want to stack multiple pieces, you can also reduce the damage of it. So you can see you can put that on your entire armor. I'm not sure if it's going to be worth stacking it on your armor, but I think at least having one of them is going to be huge value. Unimpeded reduces the potency of SLOTH by 30% as long as you have not been exhausted within the last 10 seconds. I'm assuming that exhausted in this case refers to you actually draining your own stamina as opposed to the exhaust perks. Never sure with that one, but that's what I'm going to guess here. And this is going to be somewhat nice. It is an amulet perk, so you have to sacrifice something for it. Again, health on amulet may still be good. So yeah, not entirely sure which direction this will take, if this will be valued enough. I think a 30% slow reduction isn't bad. I think it's a decent amount, but it's also not insane. So personally, I don't think it's something that I would favor in most scenarios. But it depends, of course. Like if you have something, if that's like the only thing that's holding your build back, it's that you're getting slowed too much, then maybe in wars or something this could have more utility. Distained Infliction increases the potency of outgoing damage over time effects by 15%. So again, assuming this is damage. Hitting a target inflicted by your damage over time effects will extend the duration of them by 5% with a 1 second cooldown. I think that's okay. I think the 15% increase is huge, of course. Like any bleed build or anything will want that. Or will want that is saying too much because it's a weapon perk, but it could consider that if their bleeds are effective enough. Like I'm immediately thinking of rapier builds here, of course, because you'd get more of flourish and finish and everything else. Hitting the targets to extend the dots is something that pretty much almost is exclusively beneficial for rapier builds. And even they reach like bleed cap fairly easily, fairly quickly. But I think this is going to be nice to have. The 1 second cooldown hinders it a bit on rapier in particular. For PvP applications, nah. Again, you have to have a very dot focused build for this to work. Maybe the Butcher or something like that. In PvE only, deal 5% base damage against hostile AI inflicted with dots. Sure, again, primarily a rapier thing. Don't know if the rapier really needed more PvE buffs. Answer is no, it did not need more PvE buffs, but here you go, get one anyways. Just really quick, the perks for these new items, the PvP perks, all come from the doubloon exchange, so that applies for penetrating the empowered, also applies for empowered Cleave, and that applies for Thorny Reflection, all 75 doubloons. And then the other perks you get from the new raid, and they have an interesting way to unlock, because as you can see, the only way is to salvage them. You have to salvage gear from the raid, and I'm assuming it has to have that perk for that to happen in the first place. I'm not quite sure, because the hoplite pieces here, for example, don't actually have Hasted Vigor on them. But either way, some way, if you salvage them, you can get the perk, and this applies for all 3 of the perks that I showed you as well, depending on which kind of gear piece they come from that matches the effect. So weapon perk comes from salvage weapons. So that's an interesting model. Let's see if that's something that's going to be popular. But yeah, the PvP ones would be significantly easier to get. I hope this was a useful overview. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and clicking the bell for more new world content. And if you'd like to support me further and get early trading tips, then you can do so on Patreon. Thanks to all of my patrons who already did that, and thank you for watching. Sloth, out.